The following text was posted by the Reset Era user known as Omnipotent, an anonymous video game industry insider who had a contact or contacts within From Software. This post is not speculation. This text was posted on February 17, 2020, and is the second significant information post by Omnipotent on Elden Ring. The text is titled, Omni talks about fantasy relevant to Elden Ring. In this segment we're going to go over, maybe not all things fantasy, but talk about different types and elements of fantasy, mainly those relevant to Elden Ring. Hopefully this will give some of you who are looking for something cool to check out while you wait for Elden Ring will find something worthwhile, or learn something new. To do that we're going to talk about high fantasy, low fantasy, dark fantasy, Lord of the Rings, A Song of Ice and Fire, Dungeons and Dragons, and Berserk. Note, there are no hard and fast rules as to what constitutes high fantasy, dark fantasy, etc. The terms themselves have been diluted over a number of decades for a number of reasons, as the world of writing isn't exactly black and white. But what I want to do here is share some examples of what makes one distinct from the other. Also, I am by no means an expert on any of the following, just a fan and a fan of some more than others. I'm sure there are plenty of you out there who know far more than me about any or all of these, and if you are one such individual, I'd love to have you chime in and share your own thoughts, opinions, and recommendations. High/epic fantasy. The term high fantasy itself is typically an indicator of the percentage of fantasy content more than anything else, including tone. But your archetypal high fantasy world or story has a number of elements that generally make the whole field distinct against other fantasy stories. Some of those elements being a world that is not our own. The presence of fantasy creatures such as dragons, magic, typically inspired by medieval Europe, the hero's journey, a banner cast of characters that accompany the protagonist on their journey, a light-hearted tone, multiple intelligent races, elves, fairies, trolls, giants, or whatever else your world has as native inhabitants, a bright color palette, and a number of incredibly fantastical locations that could not exist in our world. Again, none of these elements are required. You could have a story that omits having a cast of characters that accompany the protagonist in a light-hearted tone or having multiple intelligent races and still have it be considered high fantasy, but it may be referred to as epic fantasy instead, and the line there is quite thin. But we'll talk about that more later. Low fantasy. A low fantasy story can have all of the elements of the above, except that it would have to take place in our world. An example of this would be something like Harry Potter. It's got dragons and fantasy creatures, magic, the hero's journey, a mostly light-hearted tone and a cast of characters, but because it takes place in our world it's considered low fantasy. I would imagine that despite there being a number of fantastical elements, the ratio of real-world elements to fantasy would fall in favor of the former. Dark fantasy. The exact definition and distinctive characteristics of dark fantasy are hard to pin down due to the term being used and abused over a number of decades, as well as the fact that there's a lot of crossover. The only real specific descriptor that can really apply to all things considered dark fantasy is that it's fantasy, but dark. What exactly dark means can change from word to word because again, the term has been overused, but if there was a specific descriptor I would use that differentiates what I would consider to be dark fantasy over really any other forms of fantasy is that it often showcases, and or takes to extremes, the degree of hostility and malice that people are capable of, or just the overall darkness of humanity. A Song of Ice and Fire. Depending on who you ask, what sort of fantasy is Song of Ice and Fire is outside of being medieval European fantasy, you could get a few different answers: high fantasy, epic fantasy, dark fantasy, even realistic fantasy. This is why it's kind of hard to draw hard lines between different types of fantasy. There are also essentially two versions of A Song of Ice and Fire out there. There's A Song of Ice and Fire, the series of books, and then there's Game of Thrones, the television series. Well, I'm not going to make any comments regarding quality, for the purpose of what we're trying to do here, look at fantasy for fun, but also for the purposes of Elden Ring. I'm going to ignore the show and focus on the book series. This is for two reasons. 1. If you want to get a good idea of how George R.R. Martin creates worlds, characters and fantasy, you're going to need to look at George R.R. Martin's work rather than an adaptation. 2. Game of Thrones neutered and removed a number of the fantastical elements of A Song of Ice and Fire, due to budgetary reasons, production reasons, as well as in favor of wider appeal. So, Game of Thrones isn't really a good example for what we want to do. That aside, A Song of Ice and Fire features most of the above examples of high fantasy, though we can sort of remove hero's journey, the light-hearted tone and characters accompanying the protagonist, as there is no single set protagonist. The color palette is debatable, given that this is a book series, and the color palette technically is whatever you imagine it to be. That being said, there are a number of officially commissioned works of art that we'll be looking at in another section. I'm sure by now that unless you've been living under a rock you've heard of the content within Game of Thrones, and by extension A Song of Ice and Fire, how dark and depressing it is, that it's brutal, sex-obsessed, your favorite characters will all die, etc., and you might get the idea that as a result, this would be a dark fantasy series. But I don't think that's a label I would really agree with. A lot of people have the idea that George R.R. Martin is some sort of masochistic evil storyteller, but that isn't really true, and is a misunderstanding that seems to primarily stem from Game of Thrones and Dungeons and Dragons adaptation and handling of the material. Based on that image, people make a lot of assumptions on what A Song of Ice and Fire is, the way George R.R. Martin writes, and how that will affect Elden Ring. George R.R. Martin for the most part has a very unique way of writing and creating casts of characters with interesting traits, and weaving them together to create a very engaging story. The thing about A Song of Ice and Fire and George R.R. Martin in high fantasy is that in the same way that Neon Genesis Evangelion is a bit of a reaction and deconstruction of Gundam and mecha anime, A Song of Ice and Fire is a bit of a reaction and deconstruction of high fantasy and Lord of the Rings in particular, where everything isn't good versus evil, and that all your words and actions have consequences. Between that and the focus on being, maybe not accurate, I don't know, I'm not a medieval historian, but more based in realism setting of a medieval political landscape, and the result is a story that is often dark and brutal, but not out of any singular intention and desire to be so for the sake of being so, but is more so the logical conclusion of the intersection of these elements. Medieval life was not great. Rape, murder and mass murder happened often, as a result, these things are also present. Beyond that, characters dying or ending up in precarious situations, with some individuals just having terrible luck, is more often than not a result of their own actions and traits leading them down a bad path. George R.R. Martin doesn't believe in, fool me once, shame on you. He believes in, well, if you got fooled, it's your own damn fault, as the logical conclusion of many actions are often telegraphed far away, in a universe where characters can often fail to heed warnings or common sense, and the ones that get ahead are the ones that don't fall into those trappings. The infamous Red Wedding is probably a perfect example of that. But this is also what makes them feel real and the story engaging. Some people can be really great and noble, some people can be really shitty, most people fall somewhere in the middle, and have a number of traits both positive and negative, that make them an individual. Some of those traits can be a strength or a weakness depending on the situation, and how either you or someone else decides to exploit them, and that's really what it's all about. Is it still morbid? Yes. Is it morbid to the incredibly exaggerated degree that pop culture has made it out to be? Not really. But I suppose this will also depend on your tolerance. Though if you're reading this out of interest in Elden Ring and from software works in general, I'd imagine you'll be fine. Acts of sex and violence aren't really gratuitous like they can be in the show, they aren't glossed over, but given what feels like the appropriate tone and weight, while also not dwelling on it much either, and I feel are written fairly tastefully, given the subject matter. Despite events also more often than not being less than positive to say the least, I feel that there is a degree of optimism and positivity to be found within his writings. Seeing characters face internal or external hardships and seeing how they pull themselves through. While I find some characters to be far more relatable than others, I find that there's often something that I can connect to in each character on a personal level. So much so that I had once asked a friend which character I reminded him the most of, and they listed off 6 or 7 different characters. Beyond that, one of George R.R. Martin's best, and most relevant, traits is his ability to world build. Westeros, really Planetos as a whole, given that Westeros is only a single continent, not the entire world of A Song of Ice and Fire, feels incredibly vast, but also fully realized and lived in, with an increasingly detailed history spanning across multiple books, even outside of the main releases. Despite the story as a whole really revolving around medieval politics, houses and individuals far more than elements of fantasy. Many of the standard tropes of fantasy are present within the world. From its most obvious element of dragons to the likes of multiple races. Giants, children of the forest, the others. Many elements of magic. Witches and warlocks and pyromancers, oh my. And really wizards of all sorts. Multiple forms of the undead. Gods, some of many forms and some of many faces, some in high places and some much lower, some might say deeper. Literal forces of nature. And massive imposing castles and structures that have a lot to say about the history of the location, and those who inhabit such locations. All of these things have some significance in both the narrative and the world in some form or another, some more than others. While it's not really the sole focus of the narrative as it is in something like Lord of the Rings, these elements are still present. So it becomes pretty clear as to why, despite being so different in terms of tone and intention, almost being on the opposite side of the spectrum of Lord of the Rings, yet can still fit into the same category, even though it may not fit the same mold. But all of these things come together to create a very cohesive and interesting world. Despite succumbing to some tropes of the genre, it has its own unique spin on many of them, or the way in which they interact with the rest of the world makes them interesting, even if the concept isn't wholly or inherently interesting on its own. So what is the point of all this, and why is this relevant to Elden Ring? The first point being to try to sell you guys on A Song of Ice and Fire, introduce you to something I personally love, and give you something to check out while you wait and get a real understanding on how George R.R. Martin does things. It'll obviously be an influence on Elden Ring in some places, either intentionally or not, simply because Miyazaki himself is a fan, and George R.R. Martin is working in collaboration on the title. Obviously, given the basis of this collaboration, with George R.R. Martin only writing world history and helping to create the world, and From Software's general proclivities in terms of narrative, there wouldn't be much in the way of sprawling multi-character driven narrative. But again, given that George R.R. Martin is involved, there will be some natural overlap in terms of ideas and themes that are explored, and the way things are explored. That's not to say Elden Ring is A Song of Ice and Fire light or even A Song of Ice and Fire adjacent. Again, fantasy kind of takes a back seat for the most part, in order to be more character-driven by the way of medieval politics. There will still be elements of politics, this is George R.R. Martin, but given the needs of this sort of game, especially a From Software game, it's going to be more fantasy-based and focused as a whole. That being said, you'll get a much better idea on how George R.R. Martin creates a world by reading his works than you will by watching the show or even just reading what other people say about it, and you're better off reading A Song of Ice and Fire to get a better understanding of what Elden Ring is, rather than going out to pick up X European Fantasy Legend Collection to develop your ideas and speculation, and hopefully in the weeks and months to come, this is another element that we can discuss, as well as post-launch, to really help pique your interest and give you something to look at. I'll drop some of my favorite A Song of Ice and Fire pictures.